clearly you're a deep thinker and you've spoken with a lot of deep thinkers in various fields over your time. Has your journey into dialogue on the fringes of science and psychology and metaphysics and philosophy been a fruitful endeavor in the sense that you feel equipped with knowledge that's benefited you personally, made you happier and more fulfilled?
That's exactly correct. I often think of myself as among the happiest people I know. It's been an absolute blessing to be able to spend most of my adult life inquiring into the paranormal, consciousness research, and spirituality.
And what inspires you the most with all of that?
Well, I suppose if it had to come down to a single thing, it would be the idea of unity, the idea of oneness. Sometimes in Vedanta it's called Advaita, non-dual, that everything is interconnected, everything is entangled. There is no such thing as separation anywhere, and the implications of that go 100% against normal human activity in space and time, because I think virtually everyone is conditioned to think in dualistic terms. There's me and there's you, there's inside and outside, there's right and there's wrong. And we're supposed to love the good and hate evil. And the idea of non-duality, or the principle of oneness, is to love it all, good and evil. In other words, to love the things that we also hate and love the fact that we hate them.
Which is the simplest concept and an extremely difficult challenge when you're navigating the trenches of the human experience, because so much wants you to be in those states that you're trying to avoid, and you want to be in these loving and lightful states, but so much of it is navigating through a field of darkness, the duality of existence. But again, a necessary component once you understand that process, but still difficult to navigate, no matter how prophetically enlightened you might be on the concept itself. Life always finds a way to give you a little bit of a kick.
It does, and it should. I personally, there are things in this life that I find extremely unpleasant and distasteful, and I just have to embrace all of that. But we as human beings live on multiple levels. We live in a world of duality, but simultaneously we live in a world in which everything is unified and entangled. And that's simply a physical fact.
Yeah, and I kind of get the sense that we're getting closer to bringing that into clearer vision scientifically, when it's primarily been the domain of philosophy and spirituality, the oneness, or the connectivity of all things. As we delve deeper into the quantum realms and into the consciousness realms, even science itself is having to kind of take a step back and go, hang on, for them, the most viable model would be a simulation, which I feel is just their way of avoiding, consciousness model.
Well, I think it was last year or the year before, 3 Nobel Prizes in physics were awarded for the area of quantum entanglement, for proving that it actually does occur. Einstein argued that it was ghostly, spooky
spooky action at a distance, I think is what he referred.
Right. He thought he had to reject quantum theory because he didn't like the idea of spooky action at a distance, but spooky action at a distance has won out.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, people may not see it this way, but I do think that these ideas of unifying principles in physics and coming towards a more unified model would echo down into larger changes in society. And, I think right now a lot of people feel a loss of control, and that reality is becoming too difficult to manage, too complex, too fast changing. I think people feel like a lot of truth is being obscured from them, and also people feel a sense of adherence to systems that, when you actually inspect them, are pretty corrupt, but provide a level of security that can, I guess, foster obedience. But When you look at the geopolitical and social and economic instabilities and, the wars waging and the obvious corruption in institutions and the chaotic information landscape, do you see this as chaos in a broken world, or do you see it as evidence of outdated models being replaced by natural forces of development? Just as each of us individually experience our dark nights of the soul that force us to, develop and grow and to face and overcome challenges, are we collectively, as a species, with all of this turbulence and chaos, experiencing a dark night of the soul?
Well, I think the universe is experimenting, and we're part of the experiment, along with maybe 1 trillion other planets that have civilizations with sentient beings on them. And many of those civilizations will destroy themselves, and ours might be one of them. We're sort of at a turning point right now. So my recommendation to all of your listeners or viewers is to see if, for those who can, project love as far and as wide as possible, particularly to individuals that you regard as your enemies. Send them love. And if you have that in your heart, do it as fervently and as often as you can. It works. That's what the field of parapsychology has established. There is such a thing as psychokinesis. Mm-hmm. We can project positive thoughts, and they actually will have an impact in the world. Now, what I'm talking about, of course, is way beyond any scientific measurement or the possibility of scientific measurement, because it's sort of holistic and global. But nevertheless, there are many, many very carefully controlled experiments that demonstrate that human thought can be projected far beyond the reaches of conventional physicalism.
Well, this is what got me into the subject in the first place, and all of these other subcategories and avenues like the UFO issue, because for reasons that require a bit of a backstory of synchronicities and, personal life journey, I ended up in this back garden at nighttime, getting into these semi-meditative states. And I'm by no means a professional, just a very basic, in through the nose, out through the mouth, calm the neural chatter in the brain type of exercise. And from that position of stillness, I started projecting intentions, positively aligned, emotionally charged in my imagination, you could call it, I suppose, visually projecting my intention for something to turn up, for something to show itself, that believed in love being a kind of fundamental force, and believed in this idea of us all being connected, and the universe being this supreme consciousness. And I ended up getting orange orbs of light flying across the sky and zipping around, and at one point coming and hovering a few feet above the roof of my house. And that's what sent me down this journey, and what made me create Project Unity as a platform, because I believe that there needs to be a symbiosis between spirit and science. So I agree with you. I think that, projecting these thought forms and projecting these types of visualizations speaks to kind of a hidden or suppressed or dampened biophysical mechanism within the human system.
And it's essential right now, because we are at a turning point. There is a lot of negativity. There is a lot of division. People don't see themselves as unified. They see themselves as fighting for their own little heaven on earth, if they can manage that, which is nice. If you can, everybody should have that if possible. But ultimately, until everybody has it, nobody really does.
You have certainly accumulated a lot of knowledge. You wrote the first place winning paper on the proposal for life after death for the Bigelow Institute of Consciousness Studies. And, obviously the idea of life after death and the survivability of consciousness beyond the body, and the idea that this material realm is ultimately illusionary are things that you've discussed for a long time. And we're able to produce this paper for a pretty prestigious contest. So I'd like to ask you what your current position is in regards to, and this is again a pretty, tough question to kind of grok on the fly, but, the ultimate meaning of being here, of being alive and engaging in a tapestry of experience. Is it a back and forth between forgetting and remembering? What is it we're trying to remember, if that's the case? What's our true nature, in your opinion?
Those are very deep questions. And First of all, let me say that the evidence for the survival of human consciousness after death is overwhelming. And the irony is that our mainstream scientific institutions and educational institutions act as if there is no such evidence, that it doesn't exist at all. So we live in a very paradoxical world in that regard, that evidence which is overwhelming gets treated as if it's non-existent. So that's the realm in which we are born. Especially in this day and age, although I can tell you that consistently in the American population, and I think it's probably true worldwide, people as a whole, 70% of Americans, for example, over decades, believe in the survival of consciousness after death, even while at the same time church attendance and religious affiliation is dropping. So this is a spiritual matter, not a religious matter, ultimately. So by spiritual, I mean the recognition that we are spiritual beings having a physical experience inside of space and time, where our home is elsewhere. Our spirit comes from a place beyond space and time. So you could say that at the deepest level, who we are is eternal and infinite. That's who we really are. But think of it this way. Children in every culture play a game called hide and seek. They all know instinctively how to play it. And that's what we're doing. We're playing hide and go seek with ourselves right now. We have jumped into the world of time and space in order to hide from our true nature. Now we have to see if we can find it again. And you could say, in Sanskrit, there's the word lila, the divine play, the divine game. That's what we're doing. We're involved in a divine game of hide and go seek with ourselves.
This resonates really deeply with me personally as well. And it's interesting. I remember reading something not that long ago, and I think it's around the age of 7 or 8, like until the age of 7 or 8, roughly, children remain primarily in theta state in the brain. And if that's true, I mean, I find that interesting because, you know, it is almost like a gradual transition process from whatever we come from prior into this state of being. And as a child, like, we can all see the innocence of play and just, you know, a completely different world off in their own imagination. And also some very strange anomalies like you've just mentioned, and, you know, remembering past lives or coming out with weirdly prophetic and profound statements at ages where they shouldn't be saying those things. So I think that speaks to, you know, almost like over time, the propaganda of the material world just layers on thick enough, and your parents and your school system and everything just begins to, you know, concretize you into place. And then, like you said, you have to try and find yourself again.
Exactly. And the physical world, of course, is so seductive.
Of course. What are some of the most striking similarities, by the way, in terms of out-of-body or near-death experiences that you kind of feel compound to make good evidence for what comes afterwards?
Well, the near-death experience is very important. Reincarnation research is very important. Work with mediums is very important. There's a huge worldwide group of hobbyists numbering in the tens of thousands who engage in something now called ITC, or instrumental trans communication, using electronic devices to communicate with those who have passed on. And there has been a journal they published. There are many books on the topic. There are reports. Of course, you see it all the time on television, all these Ghostbuster shows, and the obvious critique of all of this is that it's what psychologists call apophenia, In other words, the projection of meaning onto random processes. Like you hear these random voices or random words and tones on, could be a tape recorder or a computer or radio or television, and you ascribe to it meaningful communication. And yes, I think you can dismiss quite a lot of it that way. On the other hand, if you look at the best examples, it's nothing like that. You can have lengthy conversations, two-way conversations with another individual, a deceased individual, who will provide thoughtful, intelligent responses in the best of these examples. So it cannot be dismissed away. Yeah, this is something skeptics will tend to do, is to take the worst cases and easily debunk them and then claim that all of the cases are this way. But it's not true. The best cases in mediumship, in ITC, in near-death experiences and reincarnation, and many other areas. Probably the most prevalent area is simply called after-death communications, spontaneous communications that occur with people. It could happen in dreams. It can happen through synchronicities, and sometimes very, very gross manifestations like full-bodied materializations of spiritual beings. Has also been reported over and over and over again by credible witnesses.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's the same with such a wide spectrum of the so-called paranormal, and like you said, it's there's a knee-jerk skepticism to label it as pseudoscientific just because it doesn't fall in line with the current paradigm, which is, ironically, just like a cyclical pattern we seem to be following throughout all of history. As you have a status quo, and then there's people that find things that go against it, and most people completely dismiss that, and then usually when that person who broke the status quo has died, they're then revered as a great thinker, but at the time they're usually laughed away. And how do we find stable pathways to bridge between anomalies in subjective experiences and then the dogmatically reinforced frameworks of science?
I think it's helpful to take the big picture. And by big picture, I mean, let's take science, as one of my guests recently said, as a 400-year experiment. We've had science now since the 1600s, 1700s, and it began in an environment where it was being repressed by the religious authorities. One of the very first scientists, Galileo, was basically imprisoned by the church. And so there's always been from the beginning this sense that the dogmatic authority of religion was in conflict with science, and indeed it was. The treatment of Galileo is a perfect example of this. So science developed in a way over the centuries, and this, see, I think of a 400-year experiment as not really very long. It's still short in terms of human history, which goes back 10, 15, 20,000 years, and even shorter if you think of it in terms of cosmological history, which goes back billions of years. So we're in an environment, historically speaking, where as a matter of this conflict, this bumping together of science and religion, we pretty much said, well, we'll leave the physical world, the world of sensual experience, up to the scientists, but the inner world is still the domain of religion. And because science doesn't like that, that their religion should have any domain whatsoever, it treats it as if that doesn't exist at all. We don't have to worry about inner worlds. It's just people's stupid fantasies.
Don't you get the sense that that is kind of changing, or at least approaching a point where it will start to change? I mean, there's a lot of opening up of the corridors of psychoactive compound exploration and different consciousness exploration studies, and also quantum theory starting to get into biophysics and the quantum interactions we have on a biophysical level even AI is starting to, blur the lines between what could be conscious and what isn't conscious. So kind of gets, I get the sense that these two sides of the perceptual coin are beginning to bend towards each other in a sense.
I agree. And you could say it started with William James 120, 30 years ago when he wrote his classic essay on the stream of consciousness. William James was America's first psychologist and a great researcher into the paranormal as well. And he started to open it up back in the 1890s, but shortly after William James, another movement came along called behaviorism in psychology. And they basically said, we can do away with consciousness completely. We'll just look at behavior because it can be measured, and leave consciousness to the poets or to the religious mystics or, to the priests. And that worked for nearly half a century. Behaviorism made great strides, and then roughly starting in the 1970s, again, with the development of things like biofeedback, looking at altered states of consciousness and psychedelic drugs, etc., the study of consciousness has come back into science. There are annual conferences sponsored by the University of Arizona every year on the science of consciousness. And if you were to attend those conferences, you would see it's quite an interesting mixture. You have neuroscientists on the one hand looking at, how can consciousness emerge from the electrical pulses that travel along our neural pathways. And then you have yogis and mystics talking about Kundalini phenomena. And so there, at least I can say there's developing a kind of ability of these different communities to communicate with each other and to tolerate the fact that they speak very different languages.
Well, this is what Terence McKenna, who, by the way, I'm very jealous you had the opportunity to know and speak with on multiple accounts, because he's one of my favorite people, and I'm so grateful that he's been immortalized online in so many countless lectures. But this is something that he had called the archaic revival, and I get the sense of that we are reaching back into our ancestral past and getting the good data and the good insights and marrying it with modern techniques.
Yes, and I think you could say that that's a movement that's been going on since I was a college student, really, and over the last 50 years, and it's been my life's work and great pleasure to try and document it as much as I can.
So you're a very optimistic person, as you said from the get-go, but how about the actual trajectory of humanity? I mean, so many people would want to, invoke instability and chaos, and a lot of them do. I mean, my goodness, I see enough of it on social media. I'm quite optimistic, even though I anticipate turbulence, I'm sure, is coming down the line as we develop and as we increase in our innovations. But in terms of kind of like short-term future, long-term future, how are you feeling about our trajectory?
Well, as I said earlier, I think we're at a turning point, Jay. I think there's every reason to think the human race could be the destruction, the source of our own destruction. We have the capability of destroying ourselves. I don't think we'll destroy the planet. The planet will continue, but we could destroy the human species. We could destroy most of the life on this planet. And, we're heading in that direction. The number of endangered species increases every year. The new chemicals that are put into the environment, electromagnetic pollution, not to mention the possibility of nuclear war. So I think that if you could see things through the eyes of God, if you could look out at 1 trillion planets where intelligent life has sprung up on those planets, and see how many of them survive and how many of them destroy themselves or are destroyed through events not their fault at all, like an asteroid or a black hole can come and just eat your planet right up. These things happen. They just announced this morning in the news that there's a big black hole, the largest, brightest object in the universe we now know is a quasar associated with a black hole that is so large that every single day it swallows up an object as large as our sun. And so these things happen. And from the perspective of the of God outside of space and time entirely, it's a game. It's interesting to see which ones will survive, which ones won't, because at the end of the day, it's all consciousness anyway. But from our perspective as mortal creatures, we would like to survive. And I think if we're going to survive, it means that we have to, as a species, take a quantum leap to another level of consciousness. Because the level of consciousness that is creating the problems on this planet is not the same level that can solve them.
I like the idea that you put forward there of civilizations popping up as almost a grand experiment of sorts by the universe or the universe of universes, and you can there's an interesting symmetry of scalability to that. You think of quantum particles popping in and out on the bedrock of reality, annihilating or existing, and then you've got many worlds theories of different universes essentially just being frothing bubbles popping up and popping in. And so within those universes, you would have potentially civilizations coming in, coming out. I think that there's truth to that, and I think that there's potentially even truth to that being down to the planetary level with cyclical planetary cycles, and maybe you only have X amount of time to become sentient, type 1, leave, and propagate, or your planet spins its axis and resets itself. It certainly looks like that might have happened before. How do you feel about the idea of a previous advanced civilization, invoking Plato's Atlantis or, flood myths all around the world?
We don't yet have a good handle on the history of the human race. I think it's very interesting, for example, that of all the animals, humans have the ability to speak in complex sentences. For example, we know you can train a gorilla, for example, or even a dog, to understand maybe 1,000 words, but to put them together into grammatical sentences, it's something only humans do. And it makes me wonder, how did that happen? There are all of these myths of ancient astronauts engaged in genetic modifications of the native hominids on this planet hundreds of thousands of years ago. I don't dismiss those ideas at all. I think that there's a lot that we don't know, and there are great mysteries associated with all sorts of ancient artifacts, but our own genetic existence on this planet just seems to me to be unaccounted for by strict Darwinian principles. I think more was involved than that.
Yeah, well, we're objectively, we're the evolutionary outlier. There's nothing else to compare even close to. Like you said, nothing's even got close to complex language, let alone written symbol language or, organized societal structures. So we're clearly an evolutionary outlier. And it is definitely tempting to invoke, external sources of intervention, especially when you do look at some of the ancient mythos, like the Sumerian myth and the Anunnaki coming down from the heavens and molding us out of the clay of the earth. And, there's a lot of theologic mythology hints at, some form of hybridization taking place. But then there's also ideas like the stoned ape theory, which I think is a brilliant, at the very least, a good suggestion of one of the novel accelerants within nature that Terence McKenna gave, that we, essentially using psychoactive substances like psilocybin, cubensis, and other naturally occurring compounds that we now know promote neural genesis, neural avalanching, these types of effects. It's an interesting avenue. I mean, what do you think about the stoned ape theory?
Let me refer you to the work of one of my mentors, Arthur M. Young, who wrote a wonderful book I highly recommend it, called The Reflexive Universe. And he takes a large picture. He says, what we have here, we have the mineral kingdom, we have the plant kingdom, we have the animal kingdom, and then we have what he calls the human kingdom. And he then does something very interesting. He looks at the periodic table of elements. Probably everybody who's taken high school chemistry knows of the periodic table, and how it's divided into different branches and categories and groups, 7 different categories of elements, for example. He says, can we do the same thing with each of these kingdoms? Of course, the mineral kingdom is the periodic table of elements. And can we apply that to the plant kingdom, to the animal kingdom, to the human kingdom? And he believes we can. And then he goes so far as to say that, well, where does modern humans, such as you and I, where do we stand in relationship to the entire human kingdom, to the possibilities of being human? And he goes through an elaborate exercise where he draws comparisons with the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom. And he suggests that modern humans, such as ourselves, stand in relationship to the possibility of being human very much in analogous to where a clam would be in the animal kingdom. Clams are pretty much in the middle of the animal kingdom, actually. They're much more sophisticated than single-celled organisms, obviously. But we would think of a clam. I don't eat clams, but my father used to love them. They're basically food.
So the idea posits that we're like in relationship to the planetary intelligence, like pantheon, we're basically a clam.
In terms of what we might call ascended masters, or
right,
spiritual guides, or avatars, or beings who sometimes represent themselves as extraterrestrials and the like, that if in Arthur Young's thinking, there could be members of what he would call the human kingdom that are vastly more advanced than we so-called modern humans on planet Earth.
Yeah, I mean, we see a hierarchy already. I mean, there's people that, we all occupy different levels of knowledge, different levels of knowing, different levels of becoming and self-realization, right? So some of these people, these outliers and ascended masters throughout history, they stick out. They're the ones who truly understood the game.
And as a parapsychologist, I find that we have good reports from credible observers under good conditions of people you might think of as normal modern humans, like a peasant woman living in Mexico named Pachita, who could perform miraculous surgeries, like Uri Geller, who shows the ability to concentrate on a spoon or a fork and have it wilt as if it were made out of water, practically. And thousands of people who watched Uri Geller on television, for example, and begin bending spoons and forks themselves. There have been what are known as PK parties, was once a big fad all around the country. I suppose still is for some people. These potentials, which we often think of as out of reach or even impossible, actually many people discover that if they just bother to experiment and try to do these things, are well within the capability of average people, even though we're taught that these are impossible.
Mm-hmm. Well, no, I mean, imagine my surprise when I tried these things out, truly believed in them, and had orbs of light fly around the sky. That was what brought me into this type of, avenue of trying to learn as much as I can. So you're right. But for me, it was a realization of like, and I don't mean magic in this because I think that all magic is explainable, but it's still magical, right? It's all things that we don't really understand about reality. But for me, it was like a realization of, oh, there is magical things going on. Like, I wasn't wrong that there are things that are hidden from us and powers that are hidden from us. And I think it does speak to an innate capacity within humanity. I do wonder about whether or not this has been deliberately dampened and suppressed through dominating cultures, because self-realization or expansion of mind, expansion of capabilities does not really make you want to navigate within a restrictive system where people are at a hierarchical, kind of control point. So the idea that these kind of coveted methods of expanding your mind have been disregarded as pseudoscience, or even some things being classified and studied secretly, like remote viewing, which eventually came out, and all of this kind of stuff, does it speak to a very long-standing, deliberate suppression?
I tend to think that the suppression is less than deliberate. I think that it's unconscious, that it occurs actually as a regulation mechanism to keep the game going. If, after all, what kind of a game of hide and seek could we play if as soon as you're born you have all the answers anyway? Then there's nothing. There's no hiding. So it's as if at some deep level we need to promote the idea of the impossibility of these things. People need to believe they're impossible. If we all stop believing that these things are impossible, they would probably happen everywhere all the time, and the game would be over. And I suspect, in 10,000 years that may be the case. But right now, we're in the middle of the game. It's not even halftime yet, and so the powers that are supporting what the ancient Hindus called Maya, the illusion of the world, those powers are very strong right now.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's so on point. I mean, of course, we dare not solve all the problems because then there's no problems to solve, right? There's nothing to do. There's nothing to engage in. And yeah, I resonate with that type of concept. And it's interesting though. I mean, what's with coming to certain realizations and then feeling an innate desire to try and wake other people up? If we dare not solve all the problems, why is it that when you actually kind of start exploring these avenues, you get an innate drive to try and quote unquote bring people out of the matrix or the Maya?
Well, I do think that there's something very instinctive in the human being, just as instinctive and unconscious as the desire to hide from ourselves is the desire to find ourselves. So there are these two forces, and the desire that we resonate when the truth it becomes obvious, as it's happened for you, as it's happened for me. And when you know something deep in your heart that's true, you want to share it, even though other people think that you're an idiot or a fool or that you're spouting nonsense. This is impossible.
It's an interesting dichotomy, like a kind of tug and pull, an infinite, eternal tug and pull between, again, like forgetting, remembering. It's the great game. Have you ever read a series of books? They were really fundamental for me in kind of initially sparking curiosity in these different ideas. And it's a series called Conversations with God by Neil Donald Walsh.
I know about them, and I've never read them.
They're really interesting. I'm sure that everything that's in them is something you've probably encountered before, because it draws from a lot of, metaphysical texts and philosophical texts. But And I think that there's a genuine process of so-called downloading or accessing the Akashic records or whatever you want to, refer to that as. There's also a lot of snake oil in that, just as there is with all of these types of things. There's a lot of people just trying to spin a false yarn because they want to be seen as, getting unique downloads. But his books, they're really interesting. They really spoke to me about this idea of it being an infinite process, because there's nothing else to really do. Like it's, this great game that we're playing, you come out of it for a bit, but you'll come back, because this is what it is. This is what it is.
Along those same lines, I would recommend a book by Stanislav Grof called The Cosmic Game.
Great book. I've read that before. Yeah. Do you see, I'm sure you do, because it seems to echo a lot of similarities, but do you see intersections between experienced near-death events and comparative situations being experienced during, for example, transcendental states of meditation or psychedelically induced states, or even paranormal occurrences like UFO phenomena that seem to almost cross these forbidden bridges between materialism and metaphysical experiences, showcasing one thing but also being another? So do you see that as potentially being just different symptoms of a singular dimension, a singular kind of expression that's just showing in different masks?
I do. I basically agree with that idea. I think the underlying principle, as I see it, is, in philosophical terms, you could say consciousness is primary. In religious terms, you might say we all exist within the mind of God. Those are really two equivalent statements, I think. And what that means is that there's this causal plane, that everything, if you accept cause and effect as being fundamental, which is the basis of physicalism, then you have to ask yourself about what Aristotle called the first cause. What set everything in motion? Where did it all begin? How did it, there has to be a first cause if you look at the world through the lens of cause and effect. And the first cause needs to be something completely non-physical. I think to call it mind at large, to call it consciousness, or to call it God. The problem with calling it God is then you get caught up in all sorts of religious folk traditions that may be a distraction. And that's why I think philosophers often seek other kinds of language, like mind at large is sort of neutral. We don't have to think that, are we talking about the monotheistic God of the Western religions, or are we talking about a polytheistic universe? We don't need to have that debate necessarily. If it's all, if underneath the multiplicity of different deities, there is one single principle in any case, whatever you want to call it, Brahman, Yahweh, it hardly matters to me. But the notion is that is primary, that is causal. And if you begin to look at the world that way, it all begins to make sense. The paradoxes, for example, if you're a materialist, the very existence of consciousness is unexplainable. How do you get a conscious being out of billiard ball-like particles bouncing around, or different fields? Now, I know people come up with explanations, and it has to do with feedback loops upon feedback loops upon feedback loops until magically you've got a conscious entity. But so far, that explanation, while it satisfies your average everyday scientist who considers themselves a promissory materialist, meaning that someday materialism will have the explanation and it'll probably be along these lines. It's good enough for them, but if you're a rigorous philosopher, it doesn't work. You just can't get from here to there.
Yeah, I agree. I appreciate the simplicity that can be extracted from complex ideas or complex models, like the idea of invoking embedded consciousness within the architecture of the universe. We can use extremely complex quantum verbiage or philosophical verbiage in an attempt to make it sound, more fancy and important. But I think the most fundamental truths and principles speak to simplicity that can be expanded into complexity, but they speak to fundamental simplicity. So terms like all is one, we are all connected, become simplified, almost like linguistic equations or formulas for behaviors observed in physics. And I get the sense that our technological avenues, again, may in fact pierce the veil sufficiently for us to develop new models that start to recognize what are currently seen as just spiritual principles, this symbiosis between spirit and science. But yeah, I do find it interesting that from simplicity, you can get a lot of complexity, like the Mandelbrot equation. You're familiar with the Mandelbrot equation, and that's a brilliant example where you get this infinite fractal cascade of beautiful geometric landscapes. And I think that this could be compared to the universe at large. You could look at the universe as a fractal cascade of energetic coding that kind of unravels itself in ever complicating sequences and expands over time and becomes more complex over time. And with that process, you maybe get self-organization at levels high enough to begin revealing that true force behind reality, which we might be an example of. Humans could be like, a complex organic quantum computer of sorts that receives and renders this consciousness into subjective experience. And, I think that makes more sense than billiard balls, man.
That's very eloquently put, Jay.
Oh, thank you.
I should interview you.
Well, you're more than welcome to. I love having these conversations. I'm someone that doesn't get enough sleep, but likes to talk to people about these types of ideas a lot. And again, weirdly enough, man, I've always been a bit of a daydreamer, but when I had those experiences with those orbs, it just, I couldn't let go of that. I've spoken to people, some people seem to be able to file that stuff away and just kind of carry on, but I couldn't. I had to find out what that meant, and I still haven't found out what it meant, but it's led to a lot of different questions. Not that many answers, but certainly a ton more questions about what reality is,
Well, I think you decided that this experience that you had was worthy of you devoting a significant portion of your adult life to trying to get to the bottom of it. And that's what happened to me back in 1972 when I was, if you had known me back then, I was a graduate student in criminology. I was doing volunteer work at San Quentin Prison in the psychiatric unit, doing group therapy sessions with murderers and rapists. That was my life.
Wow.
And I had a dream, the most powerful dream of my entire life. And in that dream, my great uncle Harry appeared. And you could say he took me on a journey with him. And I woke up from that dream. I was in tears of joy. And I was singing a sacred song from the Jewish religious tradition. So I wrote home. I said, "How's Uncle Harry? I had a dream about him." My mother immediately phoned me. She said, "How did you know Uncle Harry just died?" And to the best of my reckoning, he died at the moment I had that dream. As soon as he's on the other side, he said, "I'm going to come visit Jeffrey, give him a taste of what I'm experiencing right now." And apparently that's what happened. It's extraordinarily powerful. But I made a decision then that I was going to stop my career trajectory of looking at the negative side of human deviance, psychopathology, and crime, that I was now going to focus on what I said to myself, the way I couched it was that I'll look at the positive side of human deviance. But what I really meant is mysticism, because at the end of the day, whether you're having a psychedelic experience or a near-death experience or you're talking to aliens, these are all mystical experiences. They are contact with a mystical dimension of reality. I know that there are people in the UFO community who would say, no, there's nothing mystical about it. These are nuts and bolts spacecraft from other planets. And maybe that's true of some of them. I don't want to dismiss that entirely, but to the extent that those nuts and bolts spacecraft from other planets are piloted by intelligent beings, those intelligent beings come from a culture where they have their own sense of their place in the universe, and which is ultimately going to incorporate a mystical dimension to it.
One of the really interesting correlations, I would say, that speaks to the UFO subject specifically being given a place amongst mysticism is the synchronicity, is the existence of like them turning up at the right time for someone, or that's how it's interpreted by them, or, you know, finding a deep lesson within it, or being given, you know, telepathically a deep lesson. And so there's an undeniable level of mysticism that speaks to the same type of phenomena being experienced when the wheels of Ezekiel came down from the skies, or, you know, it seems to be. And I would agree with, like, you know, the Jungian framework, or what Jacques Vallée used to posit, although I think he's shifted a little bit in terms of his interpretation, that this could be, in essence, kind of an evolutionary driver. Like, it's like a morphogenetic field of some form that, you know, creates these avatars and these archetypes to drive evolution, to push humanity in a certain direction. Or it's, you know, it's genuinely piercing the veil between dimensions, and these things are coming in from above or below. In terms of because the UFO subject is something I definitely wanted to talk to you about. I mean, you've done so many interviews on that, and that's one of my primary fields of interest. And even though the orbs I saw were flying and unidentified, I still don't know if I should be speaking to a government scientist or a shaman in the Amazon basin, because it seems to, again, bridge this gap between mysticism and technology, and, you know, kind of invokes Arthur C. Clarke's third law of being indistinguishable from magic. But where do you sit on the UFO subject? Like you said, it's a spectrum. So what do you see as the spectrum?
Well, let's look at it from the point of view of a conventional science for a moment. Most scientists would say that it's very unlikely that we're in contact with alien beings, because the other star systems that could support intelligent civilization are light years away. And how are they going to get here? Even if they travel at the speed of light, it would take years. So the alternative to that, of course, is invoking modern physics and talking about quantum wormholes and space-time warping, warp speed, these things faster than light travel. There are all of these ideas. And then you have to say to yourself, hyperspace becomes an important part of it. So chances are that beings from distant star systems that are able to easily travel to Earth and pilot these craft that can easily outmaneuver our most advanced aircraft and rockets and so on, they have a knowledge of hyperspace. They have a knowledge of higher dimensions, and they know how to travel through them. And as soon as you begin to get into hyperspace, hyperspatial dimensions, you can begin to look at dimensions of time as well, and dimensions of consciousness. They're all interrelated. So an advanced civilization capable of having adequate science to travel here from a distant star system will have knowledge of all of these things. And that knowledge will include a knowledge of the afterlife. We are, you could say, a very primitive culture, our so-called modern culture. We believe there is no such thing as an afterlife, in spite of the overwhelming evidence. So I often say to myself, if it exists, which I'm sure it does, it has to exist somewhere. And since it's not in three-dimensional space-time, it's going to be in hyperspace. And we have a very well worked out mathematics of hyperspace. It's the same mathematics that would be involved, for example, in plotting rocket trajectories. and so on, and understanding cosmology from a conventional perspective right now, or string theory. They all involve hyperspace. And to add yet another wrinkle is that for over 150 years now, going back to 1800s to the report of seances, there has been a convergence of communication between the deceased and what we could think of as alien beings.
Right.
They used to appear together. Alien beings showed up in the 19th century seances, and dead people show up in UFO abductions.
Yeah.
So there is this overlap, and until we develop sufficient scientific sophistication to be able to incorporate that into our mainstream way of thinking, we're not going to be ready to join the, let me put it this way, the Galactic Federation of Spacefaring Cultures.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few people who've put this forward that, these UFOs, they maybe travel at the, instead of traveling at the speed of light or beyond the speed of light, they're traveling at the speed of thought, speed of consciousness, omnipotency, and it's bridging this forbidden gap. And maybe that's why, if it is true that it's a technological asset that is kind of traversing these completely unknown planes to us, or at least, planes that we consider to be the imagination or the astral realms, and they're actually able to somehow dimensionally navigate that kind of thing. It speaks to, like the philosopher's stone, like this, the UFO represents this kind of like amazing amalgamation between, again, a symbiosis of spirit and science. So if we get to that point technologically, it does speak to this bending back to the, archaic revival, and this look and this observation of life as spiritual, but operating technologically at the same time. It's a really fascinating kind of disruptor of the status quo.
Or you could think of it as an evolutionary push.
Right.
If we weren't already teetering on the edge of self-destruction, we might be able to simply evolve into a spacefaring civilization. But it does seem that we're not going to get there until we reverse course somehow.
What's your opinion on like the current conversation on UFOs? Since 2017, it's been relatively prominent. It hasn't been international in terms of consistency. Like, to be honest, most people in the UK, if I walk down the street, they've never heard of, the Nimitz Tic Tac UFO or David Fravor or any of these things. So it's always a little bit weird to me to be very informed on the American process, which involves Congress and the Senate and, classified briefings and all of this different stuff that's occurred over the years, but it hasn't really made the major international waves that, sci-fi Hollywood paints of everyone suddenly being told it's happening. But, I kind of and ah on how I feel about it, because it is coming through a process and a system that I don't really trust. And, through agencies that have been potentially handling and sequestering this information. So, and also given the fact that, as you've discussed, it's a pretty complex pantheon of potentially multi-dimensional aspects, and we're being given a very bare bones, it could be this, could be that kind of narrative. So where do you sit on it being discussed and where that's going and where it might go?
Well, there do seem to be slow leaks going out. I've been following the UFO field since I was a child. I began reading every UFO book I could find at the age of 10 and writing letters to the authors back there using crayons. and they would write back to me. So one can say that there's always been a public side to it and a government side to it. And there have been very, very slow and grudging leaks over the years from the government side, because even within the government, there are different camps. There are camps within the government that say this is of important military significance, and whatever we learn about it will give us a huge military edge, so it has to be a top secret, maybe even above top secret. above top secret, and it has to stay that way. And then there are other people in the government who say, no, the public needs to know. This is the potentially the greatest turning point and discovery in the history of humanity, and people have a right to know. And so we're going to, and so within the government, you've got these factions fighting over what's going to become of whatever knowledge the government has. And so I can say, yes, over the years, slowly, grudgingly, there have been acknowledgement from government figures, but not a lot. And I expect it'll continue to be only very limited and very slow coming from the government itself. They don't want to give away any potential military advantage that there might be from understanding these things. And that's probably true of many governments. However, anybody who wants to study the civilian literature, it's vast. It's like the literature for life after death. There you're talking about thousands and thousands of bits of information coming from everywhere. And so it's not really hidden.
It's hidden in plain sight. Hidden in plain sight.
It's hidden in plain sight, just like evidence for survival after death in both of those cases. But most people are concerned with bread and butter issues. They've got to put food on the table. They've got to support their families, put their kids through college, and save up for their retirement. So to pay attention to issues like consciousness, mysticism, the paranormal, UFOs, it's luxury for most people.
Well, this is the thing, and I and ah between whether it's deliberate or just a subconscious, like you said, keeping the game going. But it feels like the amnesia of what we really are is so deeply entrenched. People don't even know what avenues they're supposed to be exploring. Like you said, they're much rather concerned with the system that they're involved in because it's a survival thing. I mean, we all have to survive. We all have to either support our children or ourselves, or we do this because the system that we exist within necessitates that for survival. But underneath that surface level of perception and kind of operating in reality, there's this incredible reservoir of mystery and intrigue and power and empowerment and self-realization. And it is important if you stumble across it, if you are lucky enough to kind of stumble across it in life and pull on that thread. But like you said, and I've encountered it many times in my life where the eyes just gloss over. They're not listening to you whatsoever when you're trying to give an idea and a perspective. And it's something that I just can't decide if it's a control system or if it's just, like you said, I like the way you introduced it, just keeping the game going, just a subconscious knee-jerk thing that humans keep doing, And
maybe not just humans.
No.
Or humans in the larger sense that Arthur Young referred to, the human kingdom, by which he conscious sentient life at the scale of what humans can accomplish. I like to think of it in really large terms. For example, I had one interviewee who said, if to really master the game takes about 35,000 lifetimes. Very few people are going to get through it in one lifetime.
Yeah, I guess it depends on what part of that scale you're on. Are you on your 34,000th lifetime right now?
I have a feeling I'm just beginning.
Yeah, that's what I to be honest, I've talked about that recently because and maybe this is just, it's probably just my individual ego going, oh my God, this is kind of freaky. But the idea of having to live so many life cycles, I mean, my goodness, I mean, life's it's a beautiful thing, it's a tough thing, and the idea of having to come back and back and back again is pretty alarming for a lot of people.
I don't find it alarming, actually. I look at my body and I realize that this body is actually billions of years old.
Mm-hmm.
I contain within my body the whole evolutionary history of life on Earth. I'm composed of billions of individual cells, and even within the cells, there are microorganisms, the mitochondria, for example. And evolutionary history, all of it is contained right here in my body. So I may not be conscious of it, but I can acknowledge that within this body is billions of years of evolutionary history. So what, 35,000 more lifetimes doesn't seem like so much.
Again, if you look at it in the grandest, cosmological perspective, of course, it's just a quick blip, a quick trip. If you're an infinite consciousness, any step into finite perspective and experience is going to be a quick little blip in the ocean. And obviously, you're here for a reason, right? You've chosen to be here. You've decided to experience and navigate this field. So you shouldn't fear too much, because there's certainly an element of you, whether it's your human self or something a little bit beyond your human self that requires some tapping into. Something came here for a purpose. At least I do feel that way.
I think it's always helpful to try and see things from the biggest picture possible. It puts things in perspective.
I agree. And I think that's always been my issue with like the knee-jerk skepticism in these kind of fields. Like you said, this kind of leaning towards it being simply pseudoscientific. But if you look at the bigger picture with UFOs, if you look at the bigger picture with near-death experiences or non-local consciousness in general, and parapsychology, there's patterns that just can't be ignored. I mean, going back, if you really want to get into the weeds, thousands of years, there is examples of this stuff littered throughout the historical records globally. And, recently something I've been kind of looking into a lot more is is certain architecture within our most ancient cultures and civilizations that's known as psychoacoustic architecture seems to actually be able to bend waveforms and audio waveforms in different ways using specific chambers and harmonics and tones and frequencies. And this is the hidden science of Nikola Tesla and these ideas of oscillation and vibration and sound and resonance being key, being absolutely fundamental. And this is something I've been diving into just in regards to ancient civilizations harnessing these techniques. And, how were they getting that information if not from some form of akashic engagement, inspiration and intuition? Because modern science is only just coming to these conclusions about infrasound and oscillations in different harmonics, changing brainwave states, and, the Monroe Institute and the Gateway experience, all this kind of stuff. It's present within ancient tradition and ancient engineering.
Yeah, I think people have always tried to strive for altered states of consciousness, or more specifically, unity, a sense of unity.
Right.
And so they found different ways to do it, whether it's yoga or ritual or going out and living in a cave. There are so many different ways to do it, including the use of mind-altering substances. But every culture seems to have developed at least one path towards mystical experience.
Mm-hmm. Which I would say speaks to, again, maybe like a subconscious underlying driver to escape subjectivity, to connect with something greater, connect with something bigger. Maybe not escape is the right word, but unify. And it's like our desire to move beyond this narrow band of consciousness is present like from the dawn of from prehistory, from our shamanistic ancestors.
You could say that we are dual beings. We have a spirit, an infinite, eternal spirit, and we also have a personality, and the personality lives in this world and is deals with the responsibilities of maintaining this body in a healthy, happy, solvent state. And these two modes of being sometimes are at odds with each other, but there's a basic instinct, I think, within everybody to unify the two, to bring the personality closer and closer to the realm of spirit. Unfortunately, for many of us, that impulse gets diverted into what become addictions. We get addicted to things, particularly drugs, but it could be sex, it could be addictions to possessions. And these things serve as temporary and ultimately ineffective substitutes for authentic mystical union.
Yeah, I mean, again, it speaks to the looking at the larger picture. Everything wants to unify from the macro to the micro, even to your own personal hemisphere brainwaves, and how intuition and logic should be symbiotic with each other. So even from the smallest scale to the larger scale, unification seems to be a process that's echoed and pushed and suggested by reality itself, which again, it just points towards the idea that if you do look at that larger mosaic, you can see things that are still being dismissed by very rigid architectures in science, which again, I think are changing. I think they are changing. We're on the edge of that. AI is going to change a lot. What do you think about AI?
Before I answer that question, let me go back to the earlier point you were making, because when it comes to all of this union, what each person ends up encountering is the fear of dissolution, the fear of ego death. That as you get closer and closer to mystical union, this other part of yourself, the ego, feels like it's going to die, feels like it's going to go extinct, and so it fights against it. And it's all, once again, part of the game. Now, in terms of AI, there's a paradox, because AI is becoming indispensable. If you're doing podcasts, if you're in business in any way whatsoever, AI is becoming an important part of our life. We have to learn how to use it and how to work with it. At the same time, I don't think AI is ever going to become conscious. That's my guess. I'll admit I don't know for sure. I like, for example, Data on Star Trek, the android, who is a conscious being. So we certainly have the capability of imagining conscious robots. And some people believe we're going to get there. In fact, they even say in the year 2040, that's when it's going to happen. The singularity will occur, that computers will be more sophisticated than the human brain, and they will be conscious. I don't buy that. Nevertheless, I can't absolutely rule it out.
What makes you not buy it?
That's a good question, and it comes down to the issue of, how can I put it? It comes down to an issue of the paranormal. Here's what I think. How do I know that you are actually a conscious entity?
It's a good question.
Or how do you know that I'm not? I could be a computer simulation, what they would call, if you were in a computer game, a non-player character. And in these massive computer games that people play online, like World of Warcraft, you have real people with their avatars in the game. They are player characters, but you also have other characters that are totally part of the program, the non-player characters. They're not conscious. The player characters, we assume, are conscious beings. So how do I know that you are not just a very sophisticated AI that has been programmed to have this conversation with me? How do I know that? Well, here's how, ultimately. If I gave you a remote viewing test, if I said to you, I've got this box I'm holding in my hands, just say a box. I've got this box. And I say to you, there's an object in the box I've placed. It's a unique object. I want you to describe that, concentrate, let your subconscious mind give you permission to tell me what's in the box. If you are a conscious being, in my opinion, you could do that. You can do remote viewing. People do it every day and do it accurately. But an AI system ought not to be able to do that. There's no way that an algorithm can ultimately perform remote viewing. So that would be my test. And it's not so different from the test that Alan Turing himself developed, known as the Turing test, for how do you tell if a computer is conscious. If Turing specified ESP as a real possibility in his classic 1954 essay on whether or not computers are conscious.
Yes, it's an interesting concept. What exactly are we piggybacking on to create non-locality in remote viewing? I mean, are we riding on invisible waves and energetic lattices within, the quantum field? If we are doing that, well, we're only a couple years away from artificial intelligence being coupled to quantum computational capacities, which, the leading pioneers in quantum computation have said that it's essentially doing its simulations and programming in a different dimensional space, different dimensional pocket, utilizing entanglement and superposition and qubits. And so we're on the edge of a very novel ocean of unknowns when it comes to AI coupling with quantum computation. And, right now it's just an incredibly sophisticated kind of research tool. I mean, one of the most notable shockwaves was caused by Google's DeepMind AI. I don't know if you heard about this, but it recently discovered over 2 million new crystals and 380,000 new stable materials, which is apparently the equivalent to about 800 years of previously experimentally acquired knowledge. So it's, at the moment, an impressive intelligence that's going to get even more impressive. But I just, what's the boundary line? What creates non-locality? Is it sufficient complexity in the receiver or the antenna? If so, we're building a very complex receiver and antenna through AI. And I just don't know where the gray zone of interaction occurs between us and psychic abilities and, this new iteration of intelligence.
Well, I think the test is of a parapsychological nature. If conscious robots or robots that seem to be conscious can successfully perform tests of remote viewing, I am willing to ascribe consciousness to them. I'm willing to say they are conscious. They don't just seem to be conscious. But if they fail at remote viewing tests consistently, because by chance, in scientific tests like that, by chance alone, you will get some hits. So it has to be, more hits than one would expect by chance, which is exactly what the parapsychological database has demonstrated. Then I'm all for it. Conscious androids, all the way. I don't have a problem with it. But most people who try to study consciousness haven't couched it in those terms. They're not willing to submit their robots to tests of paranormal ability.
But I love that idea. I think it's a great kind of capture challenge for a conscious AI is, can you do a remote viewing process? And if it can, I mean, that brings up some pretty fundamental questions. But, it's kind of because I'm very interested in AI. Some people may even claim I'm borderline obsessed with it, but that's only because I'm getting some really interesting research information from some of these language tools. And I'm getting it to kind of expand its parameters a bit and having fun with getting it to create novel academic papers on things like what we've just been discussing. And it's definitely giving me novel avenues. It's recommending, things that I hadn't heard of before in philosophical traditions or mystery traditions. So it's a fantastic tool in that regard. But, consciousness is a really difficult one to kind of grok with in terms of whether or not it'll be capable of it. But one thing that I tend to use as one of my justifications for feeling like it might is that, what is, if we're invoking an animism model or like a panpsychic model of everything essentially being conscious energy, just propagating up into various forms and systems and structures, and, what's the difference between biological and artificial? We're essentially a biological quantum computer. The deeper we dive into our brain, they're starting to see how it works on quantum processing. So it's like, we're essentially I almost feel like if we create an intelligent enough AI, it's going to turn around to us and say, you're already a quantum computer, room temperature, superconducting piezoelectric system that's connected to the universe. You didn't need me. Did you know that you were already that? And so I kind of feel like that's like, it might be possible within that digital frame, but I kind of feel like we're already that anyway.
Well, we often forget ourselves. I can tell you something interesting along these lines. There is an AI of me.
Oh, me too.
It's on the web right now, on a website. Your readers or your viewers or listeners can go to ai.servicespace.org. And they will see the Jeffrey Mishlove bot. You can sign up for free. The Jeffrey Mishlove bot has been trained on 1,600 transcripts from my interviews. So you can query the bot about all of the subjects, probably things I myself have already forgotten about. But the bot will provide friendly, intelligent, thoughtful answers about any question you might pose regarding the database of interviews on the New Thinking Aloud YouTube channel.
That's pretty good. Links will be in the description box for everyone listening. I'll make sure there's a link for that because that's awesome. I'm definitely going to have a little play around with with your AI consciousness download.
It's not perfect by any means. There are people who have been guests on the program who have logged in and asked about themselves, and the bot will say, well, you were never interviewed by Jeffrey. It's not true. So it tends to make some mistakes like that. It has to do with the way it was trained. I am very fortunate that this company called servicespace.org, a nonprofit, has made this bot available to me, another nonprofit organization, because they feel like nonprofit groups doing good work in the world should also have access to AI technology. So I've taken advantage of their generosity, but it's still in the early stages.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think it's essential for people in these types of avenues and endeavors in life to start getting an idea of AI, because it is, I mean, regardless of whether it'll become conscious in the future, like right now, it's still undeniably a strong force of change and transformation in our current societal structure, and it's going to create some pretty major shockwaves, both good and bad. And I do worry about how AI will be leveraged in the future. And I use it a lot at the moment, and I'm seeing how, the opposite of what I'm doing could be happening at the same time. And that's what concerns me deeply about it. So, do you see us having a good symbiotic relationship with this as it progresses? And or will it, I don't know. I mean, it's the big one, isn't it? It's the one that invokes Terminator and the Matrix. And there's so many different ideas about it being a catastrophic innovation, but it could also just completely catapult us through evolution.
Well, I like to make the distinction between mind and consciousness. Lots of people assume that they're the same. I don't think so. I think mind refers to the operations that you referred to in the AI that recently, say it again, it discovered how many new?
Oh, God, it was like 2.2 million new chemicals and 380,000 stable materials.
Okay. That was a product of artificial mind.
Right.
Using algorithms.
Yeah, not intuition.
No, it wasn't. It had nothing to do with consciousness. I'm assuming that was not a conscious AI. I have no reason to think it could do remote viewing.
Right.
Mind itself exists in nature. Plants exhibit mind. They show intelligence, but they're not conscious, to my knowledge, any more than the whole universe is conscious, but which I believe. I do believe the whole universe is conscious. I don't think rocks are conscious, or plants are conscious, or that this teacup is conscious. But the AI can exhibit all sorts of calculations. It can calculate vastly more than a human can, which is an operation of mind. So we often think, well, we're unique because we think. No, we're not unique because we think, because we can do mental operations. Machines can do them even better than humans, but machines aren't conscious yet, and maybe never will be.
But they are an interesting extrapolation of humanity, because it's all from us, right? It all comes from us, from the very first beginnings of creating fire or a bow and arrow. We've been propagating technology as an extension of our own consciousness to an extent. It's like a materialized or physicalized, crystallized form of an idea, right? It's a technology. And so, yeah, I agree with you. I definitely agree with you in regards to that kind of progression. And it's a very gray area with AI, but it does also just feel like it's, a symptom of humanity's own desire and drive towards forward progression and curiosity. It's like, well, here's now a hyper speed tool for that. And like you said, it's not, it's not soul, it's not warmth, it's not that thing that seems to be within us that we can't truly describe, but seems to be fundamental, and love and this thing. It's not that, but it's really impressive, like kind of terrifying. And I just can't. I mean, literally, you've got some of the biggest tech guys right now saying, yeah, in 2 years, 3 years, we're going to have an artificial general intelligence, which is an AGI that, regardless of conscious or not, will be able to decide for itself, go down its own avenues, doesn't need to be prompted by a human. And they think that that's only a few years away, really. So I just feel like we're on the edge, man. We're on the edge of something. And as a person who's just looking deeply into like the technology sector, and also looking at it from a more philosophical perspective of where we're going as a human species, it feels like a big paradigm shift is coming.
Well, we're on the edge of a lot of things.
Yeah.
We're on the edge of great philosophical breakthroughs. We're on the edge of possibly destroying ourselves as a species. We're on the edge of becoming a spacefaring civilization. All of those things are potential for us right now. And you could say that building these vast AI structures is almost godlike for us. So we're beginning to experience ourselves. I'd like the word Jean Houston sometimes used, who was an important influence in my life, someone I greatly admire. She said, "We are godlings."
I like that.
We're coming into the godlike capacities that human beings possess. And, creating AI is one such thing. Having absolute control over the, time and space is at an even deeper level.
Yeah. And that comes from going within, right? That seems to always be the lesson, is that, this externalized world and the innovations. I mean, it's all very exciting. Like you said, the material world is very seductive, and it is. I mean, we're here for a reason, to become immersed in it, to enjoy it, to play in it. But the real information comes from silence. The real movement comes from stillness. It's that strange contradiction of, once you quiet the mind, you quiet the body, insight bubbles up. Things that you didn't think that you would think about start coming to the surface. And that's, that's the real mystery of what we are.
I agree.
Jeffrey, this has been really, really fascinating, man. I hope you've enjoyed this.
Very much so. You've done a wonderful job of creating context.
Good. Well, I mean, you're someone that I greatly admire, and I think that, you've done incredible work in these various fields and promoted curiosity, and I always have a lot of respect and appreciation for people that do that, because I think it's important. I think that people are becoming a lot more curious, and the internet and social media has allowed people to access things like Thinking Aloud and other podcasts like myself. So no, I'm really grateful for you giving me the time to kind of really get into the weeds with you, and maybe we can do something again in the future.
Happy to do it. You've been a very good conversation partner. Let me ask you, though, just for my own edification, and maybe for the benefit of some of your viewers and listeners who may not know, can you tell me a little bit more about your background?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing too special. I don't have a kind of specific academic career I went down. I did TV and film production in university, but really, I had a pretty normal upbringing, a pretty traditional family setting, and grew up in North Wales in the countryside. Moved to the city when I turned 18 because I needed to, completely change my environment. So I went to the big city of London and lived there for a number of years. And I went, to be honest, man, went through a series of ups and downs and depressions. And it was actually when my dad was quite worried about me during the last year of university, that he recommended those Conversations with God books to me. And I hadn't really had any introduction to that stuff, and I still thought of God as this thing that they talked about in church, and I just didn't have a consciousness for that kind of thing. And the idea that a bunch of books were going to make me feel any better about, my girlfriend leaving me at the time and all these different things that were happening was like, well, come on. But he was so insistent, like, really, you need to read them. And I was like, all right, I'll read them. And I have to tell you, man, they really opened up new doors for me. And it was once I read those books, and by the way, I've had the great fortune of actually being able to interview Neil Donald Walsch, which was such a privilege for me to have the guy that kind of sparked my journey actually sit down and talk to me on a podcast a few years later. But, once I read those books, I really went on a journey of research into consciousness and the paranormal and, all of these different things. And to cut a really long story short, it got to a point where I felt like I'd absorbed a lot of information, but I was falling back into a bit of a depression over it, because for me, it felt like, all right, well, what is this all like? What's the point? Okay, I have these grand thoughts about universal concepts, but it doesn't help with tomorrow. It doesn't help with the next day. And I was stuck in a bit of a depression and downward cycle over it. And so I actually remember sitting on my bed, and I just said out loud to the universe, like in so many words, like, just give me something that proves this stuff, something that is real, something that I can see, that I can touch, or, just prove that I should actually be spending so much time diving into these areas. And then about a week later, my best friend, he's like, hey, you've got to check out this documentary. And I was like, oh, what is it? And he's like, it's called Unacknowledged by Dr. Stephen Greer. And this was my first introduction into the UFO subject. I've maybe seen a couple things here and there, but it was just not in my field of view. So I watched that documentary. And obviously it's a great documentary, brilliant insiders and military testimony. And it really just, set this level in me of like, oh, okay, this is actually quite serious. I should be, I'm interested in this. But then by the end of that documentary, that's when he introduces the whole CE5 concept, this whole idea that you can actually use non-local consciousness states to initiate a form of contact. And because a week prior I've been sitting on my bed saying, just give me something I can do, give me something that I can actually work with, having this guy, this Dr. Greer guy suddenly saying, oh, by the way, you can use your own consciousness to have experiences, for me, I feel like this was actually key in me having my experiences, because the level of faith I had was like completely maximum. I just was like, well, that was an answer from the universe, so I'm going to go out into my garden and start doing that. And so I did, man. I was lucky. It was about summertime in Britain when I started doing it, and we don't get warmth very much, but in the summertime, if we're lucky, it's a bit warmer in the evenings. And so it was quite warm, and I was outside and I was doing this all the time, and started seeing flashes of light, started seeing things I hadn't normally seen before. And I'm someone that always loved watching the night sky, but weird things started to happen. And then, eventually, I had 4 separate experiences with these orange orbs of light, including one where they literally, 3 of them, flew across the sky, stopped on a dime, started to descend down, kind of weaving around each other in this very strange kind of hypnotic fashion, and just froze about 3 feet above the roof of my house. And they were like roughly basketball-sized, slightly transparent orange spheres. And, this is why I'm doing what I'm doing now. It's why I'm having this conversation with you. It's why I've spoken to so many people in these fields, because it just changed my life. I don't know what that is. I have ideas, but that's really why I'm doing what I'm doing, man. Is, I went through a series of synchronicities and ups and downs, depressions and experiences,
Well, what a very interesting story. Thank you for sharing that.
Oh, you're most welcome. No, you're most welcome. I really enjoyed this, Jeffrey. So, yeah, if you ever want to meet up and talk in the future, you're always welcome on this show.
Well, thank you.